more up to you guys than me. More up to you guys than me. Okay. We are now live. Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today we're going to have a conversation about a war. Not a very happy event, but at any rate, we're going to talk to two people who are concerned about that war, the war between Ukraine and Russia. And in Minneapolis, my friend Andrei Kamenshikov is temporarily visiting relatives, and so he's on somebody else's computer today. And hi, Andrei, how are you? You got to unmute yourself now. And here in Toronto,
thank you.
Here in Toronto is Borys Vyshnyshevsky, who is a Ukrainian Canadian, and very much engaged with the Ukrainian community. There's a huge population of Ukrainian or emigres from Ukraine living in Canada, and a lot of them are here, and about half of them, I think, work for Borys. It seems to me he has a way of providing jobs for people who find themselves in Toronto and needing money. I've sent people to him in the past, and they always appreciated what happened. They got a job for a while before they pushed on to see other parts of North America. But that was years ago, and I think he's got other things to do. In the meantime, he's been a member of Parliament for the Liberal Party. I think you had several terms in office, weren't you, Borys?
Yes, I had the honor of being a public servant, elected representative for 4 terms. Yes,
That's
I've done my public service, put it that way.
Good for you. Okay, well, you two have met previously, and I have the pleasure of knowing both of you and sort of putting you together for coffee or something once, at least once. So we're going to get reacquainted, because I think the time when we met last in person was I remember the event, and you reminded me, Borys. It was the day that Borys Nemtsov was killed, right? Because we were having a beer together someplace when you got that message. How long would that have been now? Do either of you recall?
I believe 9 years ago. It's been a while, but yes, it was terrible in the sense that a call came in from my wife that a friend, but more importantly, probably the last great hope for a democratic Russia, Borys Nemtsov, had been assassinated, and it was indicative of what was to come from the Putin regime. We'd seen assassinations and killings that the regime was behind prior to that, but that one was particularly painful, not just because I knew Borys Nemtsov and what his capabilities were, and he had such a following in Russia, but it was particularly painful because it seemed to close what perhaps was a window into the future, a democratic future for the Russian people. We often forget that the Russian people themselves are now trapped in this Putin
Mhm.
Russia, which they've
Well, yeah, but Boris, they're not all trapped. The point is, I think a hell of a lot of them have left the country.
over a
So,
million in the last
yeah,
while. Yep.
right. And that has to be hurting uh, 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 the economy as well as everything else in Russia on the government side. So, and that is one of the things that we ought to talk about is, Andre is a person who left Russia before the war began, or even before the 2014 invasion of Ukraine. But this is the current situation now is of course a catastrophe. And now you're in touch with Ukrainians, Boris. Andrei has been traveling around talking to Russians who have left Russia and are mostly living in the post-Soviet states, if they don't mind being called that. I don't know anymore, but a lot of the countries they can get into with just a domestic passport, and then they're trapped there because they can't go home without getting into trouble, probably going to jail, and they can't easily get papers to travel to other countries or immigrate to other countries. So that is an issue that concerns me. And one of the questions I'd like for you to consider and maybe talk about first is the attitude of the Ukrainian Canadian community toward people such as, well, not Andre, because I think he's as somebody who left earlier, he's not in the same category. But, as I understand it, I think we ought to be welcoming these people with garlands of flowers because they have people who refuse to go to war against Ukraine and are suffering, real side effects. Even talk of stripping them of their money at home, their property, and everything. But I think that Canada has not provided much of a welcome, and as I understand it, the Zelensky himself at first said, "Good for them," because good for them that they were refusing to go to war, and but then later I think he changed his story to say, "Well, they really should stay at home and oppose the government and lead some opposition," and of course that would be true if it were at all. It would be uncontestably true if it were reasonably feasible and practical for them to do so. But the reality is they just go to jail for sure if they stood up in public and started protesting as he wants. So I would like to know from you how the Canadian Ukrainians view people who have left Russia on conscientious reasons.
Sure. So first of all, it would be in terms of things on mind and priorities down the list. Most Ukrainian Canadians on a daily, probably several times a day, follow the news from Ukraine. And you mentioned, there have been Ukrainians coming to Canada. This has been freedom's shores for multiple waves of Ukrainians for over a century. But for many of them and the recent arrivals, they're refugees, the vast majority being women and children. And for them, their priority is what's happening back home. Many of them are from regions that are under occupation. Many others, their husbands are on the front lines. So in regards to, what should the policies be towards Russian conscription evaders, draft evaders, probably would not be front of mind. I think most, immediately, if they're avoiding conscription to fight in Ukraine, most would have a positive attitude, but it would also be tempered with, and we're seeing this in Europe as well, this worry. There's over the years, we've seen that often there are people, when there is a wave of people, there are plants that are sent through them. to monitor those emigre Russian groups to intimidate. You know, we're having hearings currently in Canada about foreign influence. Emigre groups are particularly vulnerable. Most of these, once again, you had a real brain drain that left, but most of these people that managed to escape before borders got tightened up and before Russia started clamping down on this, most of them have family members back home, so they're very careful in what they do, what they say. So they are trapped as well. They may not be trapped within Russian borders, but they're trapped within circumstances and this fascist regime that Putin has created that's incredibly violent. We referenced Boris Nemtsov. I'd like to come back to that because visually, what happened that night when he was assassinated? Everyone knows that in the backdrop, you had the Kremlin walls. So this was all planned and staged. And typically when you'd have gangland slayings in Moscow, the police arrive to do their investigations and they put tarps up so that people can't see what's going on. In this case, that didn't happen. And you had all the major channels show up, and all night you saw the police. They rolled up his shirt, rolling him back and forth in this big puddle of blood. What message was being sent to the democratic opposition within Russia? It wasn't just the assassination, it's just the brutality of this particular regime. So, and this has been a generation now that Putin's been in power, and people have been conditioned and they are fearful. So Andrei's job is not easy. People might in private conversations and, be willing to discuss, how can we change these circumstances around? But Putin has very methodically destroyed any sort of, potential opposition to his regime. In Canada, if there are conscription evaders, obviously they would need to be vetted because, as I mentioned earlier, plants are sent. So that process would need to take place. And I believe that they should be welcomed after a proper vetting, and also keeping in mind that they will be susceptible if they've left family members behind in Russia, which probably most have, to that sort of influence. And
excuse me, do you think or do you know of any cases in Ukraine of people because there are lots of Ukrainians in Ukraine and in Canada who have relatives in Russia, and are there any cases in which the government has actually used that kind of pressure against their relatives? You know
yes,
that
yes,
personally, some
yes.
cases. Okay. Well, it's not just
and out of respect,
speculation, it's
yes.
reality.
And yeah, it's reality. And out of respect to these people, I will not name them, but I will name a Russian who is in the West and who very directly was intimidated, Nemtsov's daughter, Nemtsova. And this occurred during a parliamentary hearing in Ottawa, in Canada. A so-called diplomat from the Russian embassy prior to the hearing approached her and said to
Well,
her,
you told me about that, and I think it's a very interesting case because there's so many different levels of intimidation and ways. I mean, we hear it, for example, when people talk about how Trump tells his people to do something illegal. He never says, go do this illegal thing. He always says, well, what would happen if somebody did so and so, or something like that, which is to be understood as, I want you to go do that. But so in the case that you're mentioning, the Russian diplomat, whoever he was, and representing Russia in Canada, goes up to this woman in the meeting and says, I'm so and so from the Russian embassy. Okay, she's to infer that that's a threat. But how do he might have said, well, welcome. It'd be nice to see you sometime. Let's have a drink together. It could have meant anything officially. And you understand it as a threat. But that's
Anyone,
where things are tricky,
uh, anyone that has lived through that reality, this is a daughter of a man who was assassinated by the Putin regime. And when you have an official representative, we keep trying to apply Western liberal democratic norms, and we put those glasses on when we look at things like this. Any person from Eastern Europe would clearly understand the message of what was said. I'm from the Russian embassy. Condolences on your father's death, with a smile. Everyone would understand the meaning of that, and that's why during the hearing she was obviously something that had happened. We only found out after the fact the details of what had happened. But here's another aspect to this. We have the whole concept of parliamentary privilege. It's foundational to our democracy. And the privilege of the House of Commons, is often people say that outside the House, because you want people to be able to freely say everything that they know without fear of, you mentioned Trump. Trump would often in the past intimidate people using the legal system, not because he was right, but just because he could use his money and intimidate people in that sort of way. But parliamentary privilege is foundational to our Westminster system of democracy. And that parliamentary privilege extends to committees of parliament. And that was breached. And I reported this case actually to the Parliamentary Security Services, and the person was identified, and he was supposedly a diplomat. But I'll give you another example, and it's a very personal example. And so I'm not talking of others, but it's myself. I was contacted by the CBC, I guess about 4 or 5 years ago. This was CBC out of Moscow, and they said, would you want to comment about the news special that ran on New Year's? And it was the Kisilyov, who was a Russian talking head. At that time, he was the most popular, where he talked about Ukrainian Canadians being fascist progeny in Canada. They named me and said that we were controlling Canadian seas. The question was put to me, but when I saw what they put up, and they
Excuse
knew
me, but there
obviously
was
that I'd see this.
sorry, hold on, there was a glitch. Just a minute. You were controlling the Canadian what? There was a glitch in your thing, so I didn't hear Canadian what?
Political policy. So I was controlling government policy as pertains
Well,
to,
good for you if you
but
could.
here's the picture that they put up. They put a photograph of myself with my wife, with my small children.
Okay.
So it's that same sort of, so it was a nice picture of, and then breathlessly said, and they're wearing vyshyvanki, which is the traditional Ukrainian embroidered shirts, as evidence of my fascist
Oh,
background.
really? Okay.
So, so what they're doing there, what was the messaging? The messaging was directed towards myself, and there are thousands of photographs, from Parliament, giving speeches, talking that they could have used it. No, they picked a very particular photograph
Okay.
as a
Mhm.
means to intimidate.
Yeah.
So there was just an example. So
Yeah.
it's not just Russian emigres.
Yeah, I got it.
If they
Okay.
can't, if they
Listen,
can't buy you,
but
they'll try to intimidate you.
we still want to ask Andre about Russian immigrants, though, because he's been out there contacting them and also, I presume, talking to Ukrainians and those other countries. Is that right? Because Andre,
And if I could
what
just
is your
interject, Andre, that's very, it's great of you to be doing this, and it's very brave of you, and thank you. And we need more people to be doing that sort of work. So I just needed to interject that.
yeah, right. Okay, Andre.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, as I understood, your question is, what are these people who left Russia because of the war doing today? Is that your question? Because is that what you would like me to elaborate
Who
on?
are these people? Well, no, you can talk about whatever you want. I just started up the conversation, but if you have other things that you want to talk about more, you can change the subject. You're in charge.
No, that is what I've been working on for the last year now, and
Mhm.
I agree with basically everything Boris said. I think that and how the Russian government is using intimidation, among other things, to try to silence people or to get their message across. I would
Get a
like
little
to also,
closer to get closer to your mic.
hello, how
Just get
did
a little closer to your
well,
mic.
my mic is here. I can't,
Oh,
it's
well, then
built into
speak up.
my headphones. Okay, I'll speak up. Do you hear me all right now?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Very well.
So I would like to clarify a few points that are very important to understand. There have been numerous waves of people leaving Russia or other countries of the former USSR at different times. And
Mhm.
as a result, you have different waves of Russian emigres in Canada or in Germany or wherever. In
Mhm.
Germany, I think you have probably 1 million or 1.5 million of people who grew up in during Soviet days or in post-Soviet days and left countries like Russia, Kazakhstan, where there was a very large German community, Ukraine, partially, and other post-Soviet countries. And so you had these Russian speaking groups who often are key targets of Russian propaganda abroad. And what happens is when you speak to people in other countries, Russian, people who either left Russia or not necessarily Russia, it could be Ukraine, it could be other post-Soviet countries, but basically there's Russian-speaking community. Uh, you often you need to make a distinction between those people who left recently and who left because of political reasons or because simply they didn't want to be part of this war, they didn't want to be mobilized, and this latest wave, and people who left for very other different reasons many years ago. And as a result, what happens is, I don't know if that happens in Canada and the US, I don't think so, but in Europe, where you have this large group of Russian speaking populations who have been living in European countries for many years, and many were natural and now are citizens of Germany or other countries. They sometimes they are used by the Russian government to organize pro-Russian demonstrations and things like that, and that unfortunately casts a shadow over the latest wave of people who are in a very different category, who are because they they are definitely against this regime and against the criminal war that Putin's regime is carrying out on Ukraine. But it's hard for people to make the distinctions. They see Russians in Europe with Russian flags and portraits of Putin somewhere, and that obviously is also used to intimidate those people who genuinely left because of the war and because they are against all the terrible things that the Russian government is doing today. So that's one thing that is important to keep in mind, because sometimes, well, unfortunately, many people don't understand this different.
Mhm.
And I hear, like, living in Ukraine, I hear very often this concept that these people left because they don't want to, suffer personally, but they still are supporters of Putin and so forth. And that's a message that is, I think, that is very much in favor of Russian propaganda, because they want to also intimidate these people, so they are seen as maybe being subversive to the countries that they have came to. And of course, it's obvious it would be weird if that wouldn't happen. That among them there probably are people that have been, planted, by the Russian special services. I mean, they wouldn't be doing their job if they wouldn't be using this opportunity. But that's still, I'm absolutely certain, a minority. I traveled for, I've been to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Armenia, Georgia, Poland, Lithuania, Germany over last year. And I spoke to representatives of this new wave of Russian immigrants. And I met people with different views. Some you could see they even though they left the country, they have been influenced to some extent by the propaganda. They had certain stereotypes about Ukraine. But one thing that I saw, they could have different views about the U.S., about Ukraine, and so forth, but they all were very negative about what their government was doing, what the Kremlin was doing, and so forth. So I do think that this is the potential, and these people, they still have the potential to communicate with their relatives, their friends, and so
Mhm.
forth. And of course, it's a very difficult situation. Many of them are suffering among all the other hurdles that a person has to go through when he leaves his country and basically has to start his life from scratch in a new environment. They Many of them, in addition to that, also suffer because they don't feel that they are properly understood or supported by people that are very important to them. Their own parents, for example.
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
and these people, they're people with great potential. The majority of them are young, very energetic, well educated, and this is these are the people
Well,
that
now the
really.
interesting, these are people that wouldn't have any particular reason for lying to you or disguising themselves or being really people who are trying to get to become subversive people in the West. In that, in your interviews, there's no motive for them to do that, is there? Now, you and I both have a friend, Konstantin Samoilov, in Tashkent, who has created a breakfast club for Russian emigres in Tashkent, or people at least coming through Tashkent, maybe going elsewhere. He has over 1,000 people now who joined his club. And I believe he said that he'd only met one that who was really pro-Putin or pro-government, and that he threw him out or something like that. All of these, 1,000 other people are wholly and fervently opposed to their government's position.
Now,
I think
look,
that's a very important thing too.
look, I just accept that maybe some of the people that I spoke to uh, might, be feeding information to other. I just, you have to, that's the rule of the game. You can't get in a person's mind. But the rule of thumb is that, I hear these stories. I People speak about their quite openly, and they all are very reasonable, and I understand the motivations why people left. Very very many left in September of October 22, after Putin announced his mobilization. Many people left before that because when the war began, some people left. Konstantin, that you mentioned, he came to a conclusion that he'll leave when the war began, because the mobilization that was the final straw that made him speed up his plans and leave urgently. So, but what I'm saying is, I think that there needs to be a better understanding of the internal dynamics of, and the different groups of the Russian diaspora, because that's what mixes people up. People see this demonstration of Russian speakers. I don't know if you've seen that in North America, but you do see it sometimes in Europe and the Netherlands and Germany and other countries. And also, as we know, Putin does have a relationship with certain political parties. Usually, these are the more, on the radical left or radical right, where he's capable of
Well,
getting.
let me ask Boris, because I know you know lots, you know all the Canadian Ukrainian population practically.
It would be hard to know 1.4 million meta, but I know,
Well, all right,
yes, I'm
you know a
very
lot.
familiar with
But
the dynamics.
how is there any interaction at all between that community and the Russian expatriates living in Canada, or former Russian citizens living in Canada? And do they have any kind of interaction? And how are they getting along? And what are the attitudes of the Ukrainians? And if you know of any of the Russians, what are their political views as a whole? And because we don't have polls, I don't, as far as I know, nobody does polls of that kind, specifically aimed at a particular segment of the Canadian population, which is what I would love to see. Anyway, can you give me your impression from what you know?
So there's, as I mentioned at the top, uh, when it comes to the Ukrainian Canadian community, both individually, but also the organized community, top of mind are other matters. So organizing various aid efforts for Ukraine, humanitarian. There are also, organizations are buying drones for the Ukrainian army. So these are the sorts of things that are top of mind. The other sort of roadblock to some of this is that, unfortunately, the Ukrainian Canadian community is very organized in Canada. They've been very organized for half a century. So there's a really good organizational structure. You don't find that in the Russian Canadian community, and it's much, much smaller. So, call it 300,000 to 400,000. And these are Russian speakers, so they're not necessarily Russian by ethnicity, but they may have come from Russia itself or other post-Soviet states. So it's a little different. And the organized Russian communities, and there was a vibrant Russian Canadian media community, but all of those have succumbed to the various methods that this Putin regime uses. So they create fake front organizations that pretend to speak on behalf of the Russian Canadian community, and people realize it's just, a structure of 10 people, for instance. And a number of years ago, and it's prior to from the start of the war back in when Crimea and Donbass were invaded, but prior to this more genocidal, call it, phase of Russians of Putin's war against Ukraine, there's the Russian Canadian media. There's only one newspaper that still sort of prints critical articles. Everything else has somehow been subsumed. And I met this one gentleman that used to work in Russian Canadian media in Ottawa a number of years ago. And I said, "Oh, you're now in Ottawa?" And he goes, "Yes, I had to leave Toronto." And he explained how, his particular outlet had been subsidized by money from Moscow. And now there was editorial control coming from Moscow. So until recently, you also had Russia Today. And, that the budget of Russia Today, and it's such a slick production. So most of your Russian Canadians would tune in. But it's not only slick in its Hollywood-esque kind of production abilities, but it's the Russians are globally the most sophisticated when it comes to propaganda. And the layering of propaganda and messaging and how they do it. And unfortunately, that is where most people who are Russian speaking around the world, whether it's through social media or some of those outlets, wherever they're no longer, wherever they're now not banned, because they've been banned, for instance, Canada since September of last year. But it becomes difficult. And for Ukrainian Canadians, it would be individually. I have Russian Canadian friends. We talk, and most of them kind of rue the fact, but they've accepted what their lot is in life right now. And they're also surprisingly very careful what they say to their friends. So it's
How so? And why? What would they suspect you of?
look for people. No, not myself. When they talk, not to myself, they wouldn't be circumspect. When they talk to other Russian Canadians, because they don't know necessarily where that might go if it's critical of Putin. Late night shows sometimes make jokes about things. It's dark humor. So remember Stephen Colbert, I think it was Stephen Colbert, was kind of joking about Russians in the West falling off of top floors of hotels and poisonings and that's no joke.
Oh no.
And it's good to be able to, in the face of evil and darkness, to laugh it off. But a lot of people live with that in back of mind and under that sort of pressure if they make that decision to step forward. I'd actually be remiss if I wouldn't mention a very good friend of mine who's now incarcerated in Russia, Vladimir Karamurza. He was poisoned twice and he survived. Navalny is extremely well known, but Vladimir Karamurza, what a Russian patriot. He went back, just like Navalny, he went back knowing full well that he could face the most extreme of consequences.
Okay,
I just wanted to
about
mention him as well, because Navalny is always heard of, but Vladimir Karamurza has a family, and he's incarcerated in the worst of what Putin's gulag
But
has.
Boris, he knew what would happen. He knew he was going to be jailed.
Yes.
I don't understand the thinking of either Navalny or Karamurza. I don't understand what they think is so constructive about going back and going to jail, because couldn't they do more outside? I mean, some of these other folks are, Khodorkovsky, for example, is leading a movement, well, at least trying, and he's more successful being out of the country than he is in. So what can you get in any way justify on rational grounds the decision to go back to Russia when you know you're going to be put in prison the minute you land?
There are historical examples, South Africa, but there are historical examples of people taking on a principled, conscientious decision. We talked of Nemtsov. He made the same decision. I had spoken with Karamurza a number of years ago when he was planning to head back to Russia, and as a friend, it was painful because I was quite sure that it may be the last time that we meet and speak in person. But these are personal decisions.
What did he tell you? Why was he going to do it anyway?
Because he was a Russian patriot and he needed to be in Russia during this time of darkness under Putin. That may not have been his exact wording, but that's the essence. And
Well, one
I don't judge.
admire.
I don't judge.
I
He could be assassinated. He could be assassinated, in the West, whether it's in the US or in Germany. Look, there are enough peoples that have been people that have, at least he may be incarcerated in horrific conditions, but he's in his homeland.
Okay, I mean, one has to admire that, because anybody
Oh,
who
yeah, and I do,
nonviolent
yeah.
struggle would have to say that that is exactly the most courageous thing to do. On the other hand, I would have said that too 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but and that the reason I feel the way I do about the Russian immigrants who left in order to not be mobilized is that I don't see that they could actually do anything constructive now. That the actual nonviolent resistance, it's just not possible to organize it in Russia now. And you're Andre, you're involved with an organization called Nonviolence International. So that's your occupation, to try to organize nonviolent resistance. I don't think you're even trying it now, are you? You wouldn't advise anybody to go out and in the street and get either killed or put in jail.
Look. I look at nonviolent resistance in a very broad sense. And I believe that what is realistic, I don't have, let's put it like, I do not have the moral right, without being in Russia and without taking risks myself, to call on other people to do things that put their life, their freedom in jeopardy. There's a big question here, for me, I can't, I mean, I can support, I admire people that do so, but I can't ask other people to do things, to take risks that I personally am not taking, And the fact that I live in Kiev maybe makes it a little easier for me on moral grounds, because at least I can say, well, I've been with Ukraine through this ordeal, and but but in terms of what can be done, and what I am doing, and what I'm encouraging other people to do, is to simply speak about what is happening. The reality is that most people in Russia, the majority, do not really understand what is happening. And I believe that the more sources of independent information exist, and the more we can get through, especially to those groups who are not listening to, YouTube videos by Russian opposition figures. There are probably, I don't know, at least 20 million people in Russia who are liberal minded, who do more or less understand what's happening, and who are a great audience for many opposition media sources that exist today. Not in Russia, of course, but abroad. But thanks to internet, they still have a huge group of followers and viewers in Russia. But the problem is not in them. The problem is in the 70 or 80% of the population, that it's not necessarily supporting the war. Most people in Russia, according to my own research, in my own estimates, do not support the war as such, but they still basically go along with the lies that are that that the government throws on them through its various media sources and other sources. Starting from school, starting from kindergarten today, kids get brainwashed. This year there was I can tell you just as I said, I am doing some research on what's actually happening in Russia. This year there were reports where people like the director of kindergarten said, last year or we were not, we weren't involved in this patriotic upbringing. That's what they call this brainwashing campaign. Now, this year our now preschool institutions should really focus on that. And so, and so what we can do is we can try to develop, these channels of information to those people who are to a greater or lesser extent brainwashed. We're not going to change their opinion, but at least if we can provide some information that is contrary to what they hear every day from, the media, from other sources, school, whatever, that will influence them when they need to make personal decisions. Because it's one thing when all that's really required from you is, some general level of complacency with the actions of your government. You're not directly involved. It's a very different thing when the government comes to you and say, now it's your turn to go and fight. It's your turn to turn your whole life upside down for, the cause that we made up for you. And that's when a person starts thinking in a different, with a very different perspective. It's not a theoretical question anymore for him. Mm-hmm. And that's when he himself will look for different arguments contrary to what he is told by propaganda. And if we can provide him with these arguments, that may influence the behavior of people in critical situations.
I think that's a terrific project. I want to support it in every way I can, but I don't know how to do it very well, because the people I know, the Russians I know who call home, say that they talk to their mother or their father, and they won't believe them. They say that the kids have been brainwashed. So they avoid the subject. They call home and talk about the weather or what they've been eating for lunch, but not anything serious. How do you expect them to do the kind of thing that you would like to see happen?
That's a question I get all the time. When I was traveling around, that's a question that I constantly got. Now, the issue is that it's not a question to those who are speaking. It's a question to us, to the people that are trying to speak. What do we want? Do we see our goal in changing the opinion of the folks that we're approaching, in these conversations? If that's our goal, we cannot, we will fail, because in 99.9% of the cases, we will not get the response we want. Mm-hmm. The goal that I'm trying to set, our goal is not to get, even if it's your mother or your brother or your sister, to say, I really changed my opinion. I was wrong about this, and now I believe what you say. No, our goal is very simple, is to be able to maintain communication with these people, to maintain our relation, number one. And number two, and the most important thing, is to maintain the capacity to speak on these difficult subjects and maintain our capacity to get them to hear our point of view on this. Because we cannot, a phone call or a video call with a relative will not overcome everything else that a person is constantly bombarded, 24 hours every day. Every time he turns on, the radio, the TV, he walks, he sees these placards out on the streets and all that. But the idea is to provide, even if it's just a small stream of information, of alternative information that people will hear. They might not agree with us, but they will hear this, and that will still have an effect. I just can give one example that what I personally tried to do. In the summer of 22, I started actively. They have these, these they call chat roulette, these random internet service, random communication services where you basically you speak randomly to someone on the internet, the person you've never seen him before and you'll never see him again probably. And but people originally, I think that the idea was to kind of create a video dating service, but due to the war, people started using this to communicate on political things, and I kept trying that out myself, basically to improve my own communication skills. And one thing that I used to tell people, this was like in July and August of 2022, when I would get into arguments, I would try to tell them, folks, you don't need to agree with me. I don't expect you to agree with me, but I just want you to remember, I'll tell you this, the course of the war will take a sharp turn that you don't expect in the next few months. And when that happens, your government will start mobilizing people because they don't have any other way. They will need more people on the front line. And if it comes up to you, just remember what I'm telling you. You don't need to believe me, but remember, this is if this suddenly happens, think about all the other things I have been telling you and decide if it's up to you, if it's really worth, you giving up your life to be killed somewhere in the fields of Kherson, for example. So, of course, I don't have any feedback. I don't know how many people remembered this, but I have idea that quite a few probably did because
I think if you phrase it that way, they would. They wouldn't help. They couldn't help it. Yeah.
Yeah, and so the I'm speaking about this because it's important to get these you have to find these ways. My goal was not to I mean, ideally, we would all like, after a conversation to see that a person changed his opinion, but that doesn't happen. That's not a realistic expectation. We need to be very, very realistic about what we can expect from our work. And if we set reasonable expectations for ourselves, then we can be more effective. If we expect too much, something unreasonable, then we just get discouraged, and then we end up with people, and many people that I spoke to said, this is useless. People are brainwashed, And what I keep saying is, yes, people are brainwashed. Yes, they do not change their opinion after speaking, but that does not mean that what you're doing is in vain. Because by doing what you're doing, you are providing them with these pieces of alternative information to what they hear every day. And at some point, they will be required to make personal decisions. The government will try to get them to do things that they don't want to do. They don't want to do. No one wants to go and fight. I mean, unless you're really insane, but those people are probably on the front lines already. No one wants to, give up his ordinary life and go sit in a trench and get killed somewhere, or end up being disabled for the rest of his life, or have his children or his close relatives or friends go do that. So when it comes to personal decisions, that's when this information will make a difference.
And I think also we tend to underestimate how quickly people can change their minds under certain circumstances. I mean, I remember when the end of the Soviet Union took place, and people in that period of time, people were flipping from being hardline old Communist Party members, real fervent believers, into all kinds of other, much more democratic ideologies. But now, I mean, people, a whole population can just switch their opinion overnight almost. And that always surprises me. uh, but anyway, I think it can happen even with individuals. You never know when people are going to change their mind instantaneously. And
The
that,
reality,
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
Boris. Yeah,
Uh,
Boris.
There's also one other dimension to this that we haven't touched upon. A lot of people lose sight of the fact that Russia is a Russian federation. It's not, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and a few other major cities, mostly within the European part of the Russian Federation. There are many ethnicities within Russia, some within the European part, especially around the Caucasus Mountains and around the Caspian Sea, but also in Asia. And besides Putin's stated goal, the annihilation of a democratic state of Ukraine of over what was over 40 million people, there's also the unspoken reality that the numbers are showing. And a lot of those ethnic groups and ethnic minorities are vastly disproportionately being conscripted into the army. And they are dying. And people are starting to realize in those communities what's happening. So if we start we might see some resistance. We're seeing some resistance currently. The wives of soldiers on the front, wearing the white headscarves. But we should also
Sorry,
watch the
what's that about?
resistance.
Hold on. What's this white
I'll come back to that.
headscarf?
I'll come back to
I,
that
I,
in
I
a
hadn't heard that, so I don't know what it
okay.
means.
Yes, so I'll come back to that. But where you'll see things bubbling up, and it's below the surface. So it speaks to, 91, when you said, the Soviet Union collapsed and all of a sudden all these people had change of mind. The KGB had this incredibly sophisticated intelligence gathering apparatus. But I used to say, you'd look at the Soviet Union, it seemed that everything was calm on the surface. But if you had the ability to dive below the surface, you'd see things starting to boil.
Mhm.
And I haven't traveled into those regions, obviously, and I don't know for sure. Whereas I had traveled in 91 and prior to 91 for a number of years through the Soviet Union. But I suspect that there really is opposition in many regions where there are other nations that are part of the Russian Federation that realize that there's an ethnocide taking place against their peoples. And you will start seeing resistance
Yes,
in
but
those regions.
it's not just those people, because if you remember when Prigozhin went into Rostov-on-Don, he invaded and he took it over in just hours, because everybody was, and there were streets lined with people welcoming him. Now these
Now
were
that's an interesting case, and you have others, from
yeah.
the far right. You have a fascist state, but then you have sort of the people that subscribe to Putin's revanchist imperialist ideology, and they just don't think he's going far enough in the way he's addressing this war. They think things should be more brutal. Prigozhin was in that, but there are other examples of that. And when he incarcerates individuals such as that, they might be watched at home, or they might receive a sentence of 4 years, like Strelkov recently, which is compared to someone like Karamurza or Navalny, it's a slap on the wrist. But because they're of the same ideological bent as Putin, this revanchist Russian imperialist Ruski Mir, he deals with them somewhat differently. But the people greeting, you won't see someone like Navalny or Kara-Murza, if they came out greeted by the same sort of crowds, maybe over time that you saw in Rostov-on-Don.
But you're assuming well something I don't know. Maybe that's true that those kids there were young people, especially I think those kids who were out there, blowing kisses at Prigozhin were fascist. They may have just been somebody who didn't like Putin, and anybody that would stand up to Putin was their man. I don't know. I
Could
mean,
be, but they
Andre,
could be, but
Andre,
they,
you may have an opinion. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Prigozhin was very active on social media. And young people obviously spend a lot of their time on social media. And if you watched and listened to the brutality of what Prigozhin was saying, he'd often, as a backdrop, have corpses. So
Yeah.
if you come out in the street applauding someone that you watched over and over, applauding what is a death cult, I'd be very careful in my assumptions of what their leanings may or may not be.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to comment. First of all, we really should understand that in the case of Russia, when you hear about a survey that shows percentage figures of, I don't know, support of the war, against the support of Putin, it's all absolute crap because you're not going to have any objective sociology in a totalitarian state. And unfortunately, people just don't realize that. When almost every day or every second day you hear about another research, some university in Chicago did a research of public opinion in Russia and came out with these figures. And then these figures get, people refer to them in Ukraine, international. So it means absolutely nothing because number one, 80 to 90% of the respondents, when they're asked, they simply they refuse to answer. They simply do. So you end up asking, one people out of five, or one person out of five, one person out of 10, and and then you come up with some kind of numbers and some kind of percentage point. It's ridiculous. And of course, most people that do respond, keep in mind that what they say can be turned against them. So
Okay, but you got to take sides. Boris and I have very different impressions of what it means, or what it meant in Rostov. What did you think it meant? Do you think these were pro-fascist kids?
I want to say about Prigozhin, a few things. I absolutely agree that he was a terrible figure, basically a death cult kind of figure. But it's also true that he actually criticized the whole war in Ukraine, and basically he said that this is senseless. This wasn't thought through and so forth. So he criticized. Yeah, you can't say he criticized it from a right, a more extreme point of view, but basically he said, it's about time we call, we just quit and things like that. So in that sense, and he was appealing to, when he was appealing to people, he was appealing from this, very populist kind of, he called his march for justice, he was, and that's what many people like, justice is it's a very dangerous word. Every time something terrible happened, most of the worst atrocities in humankind were made in the name of justice. Communism was, all about justice, and so forth, and other, many other totalitarian regimes as well. So and so Prigozhin basically used the same wording, but I think that
You gotta finish quick. We're way over time.
Yeah, I think that among the people that support, there were some genuine fascists. There were some, in Russia, you have a contrast between the leadership. I would say they're corrupt, fake fascists, primarily the people in the leadership, and then you have this genuine fascists that really believe in the nonsense, that is being, that the government officially stands for, but the government doesn't believe it to themselves usually. So you have.
Okay. Well, we've used up our time and then some. Boy, would I love to keep going though. I'd have another hour easily if I could. So anyway, I got to thank you both because I've kept you from appointments, Boris, and I apologize. Tell your friends I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry because it was fun. Thank you, and it's been delightful. And Andre, go out there and save the world for us because I don't know how well we're doing
I
here.
don't know. I don't know. I'm not sure I'm doing very well either.
Well, onward, all of us. Thank you so much.